Greetings. I hope that you're doing well. I wanted to do something a little bit different for our clinical connection for this unit. Instead of doing another case study, I wanted to present some of my research. I am more of a clinical researcher, meaning that I look at actual clinical problems and in a little bit more structured way, see if we can help find answers or at least evidence to help guide us in what we do clinically. And sometimes that goes as far as when we know that a tool is being used, is it really valid and reliable for a certain population? And so this is my pre-dissertation project that I defended and everything almost, well, frankly, over a year ago now. I'm working on my dissertation and have been working on my dissertation for about a year now. And I want to share this with you because I study kind of two things. Big picture, I really am more about assessment than anything else. And then I kind of have focused on vocal fatigue as a functional voice disorder and a very common population that experiences vocal fatigue, teachers. So without further ado, I'm going to give you a little bit of an abridged and abbreviated uh, cliff notes of my sorry, my camera is going crazy. Of my research that I've done as a dissertation or as a doctoral candidate. Here we go. So, one of the things I'd like to kind of share with you regarding my research is that at the end of the day, you may or may not be familiar with who this is on the screen. And so, for those of you who don't know, this is Michael J. Fox, who is a Canadian and American actor who was diagnosed with early stage Parkinson's. He's known for Back to the Future and a few other popular TV shows. When interviewed about having Parkinson's, he actually provided a quote, and this is simplified, that really at the end of the day, make no doubt about it, the people living with the condition are the experts, not the doctors, not the clinicians, but the people that have the condition. And I've always thought that that quote was actually quite powerful, that as researchers and clinicians, we need to understand that we might be the expert in the processes, but we're not the expert in their experience. Now, Yorkston and Baylor, you probably have no idea who they are. They are two research speech language pathologists who really specialized in what's called a life participation approach. And one of their articles from 2019 begins with, ultimately, only our patients can determine if treatment has been effective or not. At the end of the day, if a patient doesn't believe they have benefited in some way, then really we haven't met our goals. That's where they can say the perfect R, they can swallow certain consistencies, but at the end of the day, if they're not able to do more of what they want to be able to do, then ultimately we've not been successful. Treatment hasn't been effective. Now, I had the privilege in this study of interviewing 6 school teachers. This was a qualitative study. And one of them I feel really hit home with this quote from the interview. And that interview, or the quote I'd like to share with you is, I feel like I have to change my life, work and personal, to keep my voice in order to see and be there for my kids. And the kids she's alluding to aren't her own children. They are the 90 plus children in over 6 sections of physical education in a public school in Dallas. This participant was a PE teacher and frequently had voice problems. And what she's basically commenting here is that she feels like she cannot live life to the fullest because in order to do her job, she has to make sure her voice stays preserved. And what a good insight and an understanding that we need to have as clinicians. And then we can all relate to filling out patient information. We can all relate to when a doctor comes in and says, tells me what's going on. Probably one of the most frustrating things is though when you feel like you're not being heard, you're not being listened to, or more importantly, of all the questions we ask, you didn't ask the one that mattered most to me. And so my research actually focuses on, what do patients want us to ask them, and how do we formally use that to assess and drive therapy? Because the reality is that in evidence-based practice, which I'm sure you've heard like a broken record at this point, is that in reality, in the real clinical practice, and speech language pathologists are not, and audiologists are not isolated that we're guilty of this. Doctors do it, nurses do it, all healthcare professions do that. Is that in reality, we tend to at least consider research and clinical experience far more than we do patient perspectives. This is why on the slide you see that the seesaw is going over that way, because we often value those two parts of evidence-based practice more than our patient perspectives. So what does all of this mean? How can we actually assess these very important phenomenon that can only come from patients? And my response is, let's go to proms, but not the type of prom where you get dressed up, go eat, and dance when you were in high school. Instead, I'm talking about patient-reported outcome measures. The US FDA defines them as reports of status of patient health condition directly from the patient without any input from a clinician at all. It helps us measure and assess subjective but quite authentic constructs. And usually, patient-reported outcome measures come in the form of a questionnaire from survey research. Now, as you're in a voice class, this is where it's quite important. Voice clinicians have been using proms and related self-evaluation tools for quite some time. In fact, Roy et al. Asserted that patient self-evaluation was crucial in order to understand the multifaceted aspects of a voice disorder, and that no objective measure supersedes patient perspectives. That comes from Dr. Francis, who is a research otorhinolaryngologist at Vanderbilt. When Francis et al. In 2017 did a systematic review of voice-related patient-reported outcome measures, they found that there were 32 voice-related prompts for adults, 16 constructs ranging from voice handicaps, such as what the vocal fatigue or voice handicap index measures, to vocal effort, to singing, etc. And then 41% of them had patient input. Now, this is where this becomes a problem, is that if they're patient-reported outcomes, ideally, all of them should have some sort of patient input. And when we don't have that patient input, it's really a problem of content validity. Now, one of the constructs that was identified in the systematic review is one referred to as vocal fatigue, which we could have a whole debate and discussion on what vocal fatigue actually is. And frankly, it's a symptom commonly associated with voice disorders. Clinically, we may refer to it as just a tired voice. But again, for something so simple clinically, there's actually multiple perspectives and definitions. There's two major philosophies to vocal fatigue. One is the physiology approach, which is where the systems adapt in their performance to function, while the other one is much more patient-centered and focuses on symptoms, which is the description or experience of vocal fatigue. There is a very specific patient-reported outcome measure that examines or identifies vocal fatigue. It's known as the Vocal Fatigue Index, or the VFI, by Nanjardreshwaran et al. In 2015. They provide a definition of vocal fatigue that says that vocal fatigue is a self-perceived symptom set. Especially makes sense because it's a patient-reported outcome measure. It's composed of 19 total questions across 3 distinct factors. But here's the problem with the current vocal fatigue index. Although it is a very, very well studied, it's very valid, it's not without its limitations. And the two major ones are that, first, no participant involvement occurred in the item development. It was developed purely with expert opinion. Next, it was not validated on a professional voice user population. It was validated on a population of persons with voice disorders, but had no indication or no suggestion of what their occupation was. So we really need to find out if the information for this patient-reported outcome measure was actually, in fact, valid from a content perspective. Now, Dr. Nanjardeshwaran and her team continued to study the VFI, and she did what's called a MOCAN analysis with teachers. And essentially, she wanted to see how vocal fatigue differs in a professional voice user population using the VFI. And the results using this MOCAN analysis, which frankly, it does a bunch of testing that then creates hierarchies or a list of questions from the most relevant to the least relevant. The least relevant they are, the more you can't scale them. Which you'll see in these little pictures. You see some items disqualified from scaling. But there were 4 different hierarchies. all teachers, regardless of level of vocal fatigue, made up one. Teachers without vocal fatigue made their own. Teachers with low vocal fatigue made its own, and teachers with high vocal fatigue. So what this basically indicates is that, first of all, vocal fatigue as a phenomenon exists very differently in a sample of people that share something in common, that they're teachers. It also indicates that maybe we need an instrument that's a little bit more sensitive and specific to vocal fatigue in teachers. So this is where my research project came in to play. That's the gap in the literature, is that, first of all, the vocal fatigue index did not have patients participate in developing the items. Second of all, it wasn't validated on a professional voice use population. And third of all, the evidence is showing that we need a tool that is better designed for teachers. So my research aims were, first, to identify problematic characteristics in individual VFI items for teachers. Aim two was where we are going to determine additional experience of symptoms that reflected vocal fatigue in teachers. Essentially, we wanted to know whether or not the items not only made sense and were worded appropriately for teachers, but also that they were relevant and meaningful to the teachers. And then last, we wanted, based on those first two aims, which questions best reflected the teacher's experiences of vocal fatigue and which should be reconsidered. So the method that I used was a qualitative technique known as cognitive interviewing. This comes a lot from the literature and work of Mr. Willis. And so basically, in other fields, it's a very common qualitative pre-testing method, which you have certain people who meet criteria and could possibly be your respondents to your questionnaire, examine the questions and give you feedback. It has grown in popularity for our own field for questionnaires. I utilize Rothrock's et al.'s framework, as illustrated here. And actually, part of my inspiration for this study came from the audiology literature, in which Miller et al. In 2017 took the communication participation item bank items. And this, since those were validated more for persons with speech and language problems, they wanted to see if they were relevant for persons with hearing loss. So I had to develop a protocol to interview these teachers. So figure one illustrates that. We went with scripted programming, meaning I asked them the same probes each time. We went with retrospective, meaning that after they read the question in the item, we asked a question. We also tried to not be biased in our wording and made them very respondent driven. And before we did any real testing, we did a pilot test with a volunteer. These are the probes. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but basically you can notice that we try to keep it balanced. That's, for example, probe 3, tell me about how easy or difficult it was to answer this question. And then if they said difficult, we had what was called a conditional probe, that we wanted to know really what makes it different to answer the question. We also wanted to give them the opportunity to provide any additional thoughts, comments, or suggestions. The first two questions definitely address aim 1 and 2, and then the probe 3 and 4 definitely do more for 1. 5 was, again, to elicit any other thoughts. But a patient-reported outcome measure, much like other tests and questionnaires, even though we're looking at individual items, it functions as a whole component, right? It functions as a tool. So we did have some end of interview probes that we asked about the entire instrument. So the first one was about defining vocal fatigue. Then tell me how this questionnaire as a whole is relevant to you. And then please share any ideas, topics, concerns, or feedback. Just a little bit about the demographics. So in qualitative research, because we're dealing with verbal data, not numerical data, we don't have large sample sizes. You worry about saturation and theme emergence. And again, it's not uncommon that you have a very small sample size in qualitative research. So I had 6 participants, and you can kind of see the demographics there. The majority of them actually very engaged in certain disciplines such as physical education and the arts, where you probably have to use your voice. Predominantly, we had 2 male teachers compared to female, and all of them were from Texas except for one was from New York. It's important to look at because vocal fatigue can either be a state or a trait. Again, outside of the confines of this course. But what this all means is that we looked at various data, And to some extent, all of them have some sort of vocal fatigue, depending on the instrument that you use. Now, so what? What happened when I got my results? I'm not going to go through my results terribly in detail. I'm going to do more of the discussion just for the sake of time. So, aim one with the data we found is that the majority of the VFI items were very easy to understand and they had very minimal problems. The most commonly saturated question feature themes were assumptions and clarity. Really, clarity was the number one. There's items in the VFI that talk about the neck and the throat. Teachers questioned what was the difference, as well as maybe some assumptions about effort, which was item 18. The VFI items were extremely relevant to the teachers, but we also noticed that it may not be limited to the purely symptomatic that we had really built the vocal fatigue index around. And then aim three, there were 3 items that should be at least considered for revision, if not elimination. And then my future studies, my dissertation is going to be develop the teacher specific VFI or the VFI teach. So, if you get anything out of my talk today, it's that I want you to remember that really only at the end of the day, our patients can tell us what matters. It doesn't matter what our goals are if they're not in line with your patients. Do not think that your tools and techniques, just because they claim to be patient-centered, necessarily are. We have to have good, valid tools to really capture our patients' experiences. We cannot do that by doing accuracies and check marks and giving standardized test batteries. Really, we have to get valid information from our patients. And that is essentially my pre-dissertation study in a nutshell. So a little bit something different. You're in undergrad research, and just thought it might be nice to connect it with our concepts that we're learning about this week. So I hope that you're having a good time. If you have questions about this, if you're inspired to maybe pursue research, let me know. We will, of course, talk later. Bye.